The void has a sound, a low, resonant hum that is less a noise and more a physical pressure against the soul. It is the sound of silence given weight, the groan of a galaxy dying by inches. In the command spire of the Imperial battleship Eternal Crusader, Lord Admiral Valerius knew this sound intimately. It was the backdrop to his entire life, a life spent patrolling the bleak and empty fringes of the Segmentum Obscurus. For 73 standard years, he had kept his vigil, watching the silent, unmoving boundary markers of the ghoul stars. They were ancient things, erected in a forgotten age, their purpose known only to the most secretive ordos of the Inquisition. Their message was simple: nothing good lies beyond. Turn back. His grizzled face, a topographical map of scars and fatigue, was lit by the soft glow of the hololith. It displayed nothing but empty space and the cold, dead stars of the frontier. Another cycle, he muttered to his adjutant, a young man named Proctor whose beard had yet to know its first gray. Another decade of silence. What are we even watching for, Proctor? What could possibly be out here that warrants a battle fleet's eternal vigil? Legends, my lord, Proctor replied, his voice carefully neutral. The Ordo Xenos dictates from the comfort of their marble fortresses on Terra, Valerius interrupted, not with malice, but with the profound exhaustion of a man who has been waiting too long for a threat that never comes. They speak of ancient horrors, dead empires, and boogeymen from the dark. I have seen more action from asteroid drift than from any Xenos threat in this sector. He gestured to the vast, star-dusted blackness. There is nothing here, only dust and echoes. It was then that the silence changed. The deep hum of the void was pierced by a shriek from a sensorium auger bank. A klaxon, unused for generations, began to wail a low, urgent pulse. The crew on the bridge, a well-drilled machine of mortal men and women, froze for a single, heart-stopping second. They had trained for this, but never in their lifetimes had the alarm been anything but a drill. "Contact!" a sensorium adept cried out, his voice cracking. "Bearing 030 ecliptic, multiple contacts, they just appeared, my lord." No warp translation signature, no engine flare. They were not, and then they were. Valerius was on his feet, his weariness sloughed off like an old cloak. Magnify, now. The hololith shimmered and resolved. At first, it seemed like a glittering nebula, a cloud of metallic dust. But as the resolution sharpened, the truth became horrifyingly clear. It was a fleet, but no fleet Valerius had ever seen. There were no roaring plasma drives, no gothic spires reaching for the heavens, no garish icons of faith or skulls. These vessels were sleek, impossibly so, crafted from living metal that seemed to drink the light. They were silent, gliding through the void like knives, their forms a blend of organic curves and razor-sharp geometry. They moved in perfect, unnerving synchronicity, a school of lethal fish in an ocean of night. And at their heart was a construct that defied scale, a crown-shaped vessel so vast it occluded the stars behind it, its edges sharp enough to wound reality itself. Valerius felt the blood drain from his face. He knew this. From forbidden texts, from the most classified of briefings. A myth, a children's tale, used to scare novice adepts. By the throne, he breathed, the oath a prayer and a curse. Necrons. The word spread across the bridge in a terrified whisper. Necrons, the soulless ones, the ancient enemy. "All hands to battle stations," Valerius roared, his voice finding its old strength. "Power all weapons. Raise void shields. Dispatch a priority astropathic message to Battlefleet Command. Code, Exterminatus Extremis." The message is one word only. One word. Proctor, his face pale, looked at his admiral, his hand hovering over the communique rune. "My lord? The word?" Valerius turned, and for the first time, Proctor saw true, undiluted fear in the eyes of the old warrior. It was a fear not of death, but of prophecy fulfilled. "Sarek," Valerius said, the name tasting of ash and dead worlds. "Send the word, Zarek." The astropath, a wizened husk of a man named Alaric, seated in his sanctum deep within the Eternal Crusader's hull, received the command. He did not hear the klaxons or feel the tremors of the ship powering its weapons. His world was one of psychic resonance, the shimmering currents of the immaterium. He felt the sudden, violent stillness of the void around them, a silence so profound it was a scream against his soul sight. When the command reached him, the single, forbidden name, a cold dread, colder than the grave, seized his atrophied heart. He joined his mind with his choir, their collective consciousness reaching out, a fragile beacon into the raging storm of the warp.
They prepared to send the single, catastrophic word, but as their psychic signal lanced outwards, it did not travel unimpeded. It struck something, a presence in the Empyrean, vast and metallic and utterly silent. It was not a demon, it was not a living mind, it was a wall of absolute anti-psychic negation, a null field on a galactic scale. The stropathic choir's unified scream was met with nothing, not even an echo. The signal did not bounce back, it was simply erased, unmade the moment it was sent. Alaric gasped, blood trickling from his nose. The message is silent. The stars themselves have gone deaf. On the bridge, the tactical display lit up with impossible data. The Necron fleet was not slowing. It was not deploying attack craft or powering obvious weapons. It was simply continuing its advance, its trajectory a straight, unconcerned line that would bring it directly through the Imperial battle fleet. "They're ignoring us, my lord," the tactical officers reported, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and insult. "They are not altering course. They are not even acknowledging our presence." "Then we will make them acknowledge us," Galerius snarled. "All batteries, target the lead vessel. Lances, fire at will." The Eternal Crusader shuddered, as its massive laser batteries unleashed beams of incandescent light, capable of carving continents. The beams struck the lead Necron side ship. There was no fiery explosion, no buckling of plates. The living metal of the hull shimmered, and the lance beam simply dissipated. They were absorbed, their energy bleeding away in a cascade of harmless light. A moment later, the side ship returned fire. It was not a laser or a plasma bolt. A emerald beam, cold and silent, lanced out. It did not strike the Eternal Crusader's void shields. It bypassed them entirely, striking the hull amidships. There was no explosion. The section of the battleship simply disassembled. Armor plating, structural supports, conduits, and the hundreds of crewmen within all of it unraveled into their constituent atoms in a wave of silent green light. One moment, a thriving section of the ship. The next, a geometrically perfect hole opened to the void. No fire, no scream, just deletion. Panic, pure and undiluted, began to spread on the bridge. This was not war as they knew it. This was eradication. Then, the main hololith flickered and died, replaced by a new image. It was not a transmission. It was an imposition, a data stream forced directly into their systems. It showed a galaxy, not as it was, but as it had been. Worlds teemed with life, not human, but vibrant and ancient. Then came the star gods, thus then, and the war that shattered heaven. They saw the Necron tire, desperate and dying, making their Faustian pact. They saw the biotransference, not as a glorious ascension as some Necron cults believed, but for what it was, a horrific, soul-rending process where living beings were stripped of their flesh and spirit, their consciousness trapped forever in unfeeling metal. They saw the silent king, Sharik, in his moment of ultimate victory and ultimate damnation, realizing he had led his entire race into a gilded extinction. They saw his great work, the command protocols that sent his people into the long sleep, and his self-imposed exile, a penance of 60 million years. The vision shifted. It showed the galaxy now, the Imperium of men, a bloated, superstitious carcass of its former self, squatting in the ruins of the Necron's birthright. It was not a declaration of war. It was a statement of ownership. It was an eviction notice, written in blood and memory. The image on the hololith focused on a single, silent figure seated upon a throne of black stone, a massive, dormant warship shaped like a crown floating behind him. He held a great staff, and his oculars burned with the cold, ancient light of a dead star. The Silent King had returned, and his message was clear. We are the landlords of reality. You are merely tenants, and your lease has expired. The psychic backlash was a physical blow. Astrapaf Alaric was thrown from his chair, his mind seared by the absolute nothingness that had consumed his message. His choir was not so lucky. Their minds, linked so completely to the sending, were extinguished, not killed, but erased. They slumped in their harnesses, their brains reduced to inert matter, their souls scoured from existence by the Silent King's null field. Alaric clawed at the deck, his sightless eyes weeping tears of blood. He could not see the Necron fleet, but he could feel its presentia spreading cancer in the firmament, a hole in the universe where the warp itself dared not flow. It is not a fleet, he rasped to the empty, reigning air of his sanctum. It is an ending. On the bridge, the cold, hard truth of the day visual was far worse than any Xeno's war chatter. It was a history lesson from hell, delivered with the dispassionate clarity of a god machine. The crew, from the lowliest servitor to Lord Admiral Valerius himself, stood frown-seen, their minds reeling from the forced upload of cosmic genocide and soul theft, the sheer scale of time, the depth of the tragedy, the absolute alienness of the enemy, was a weapon more potent than their disassembler beams. Proctor was the first to break the silence, his voice a thin, reedy thing. They have no souls. The machine god preserve us. They are empty. They are what remains when faith is gone. Valerius did not respond. His strategic mind, honed over decades, was desperately trying to find a pivot, a weakness. They could not fight this. They could not run from it. They could not even warn the Imperium. They were the canary in the coal mine, and the air was already poisoned. His eyes were fixed on the tactical display, which now showed the Necron fleet's inexorable advance. They were not heading for the Eternal Crusader or any other ship. They were moving, with chill and purpose, towards the system's marginal world, a barely habitable mining planet designated Gamma Minus 7 Tertius, a world of 5 billion souls. How? Valerius barked, the command tearing from a dry throat. New heading, intercept course. We are placing ourselves between that fleet and Gamma Minus 7. My lord, the helmsman stammered, their weapons, our void shields are useless. We are not trying to stop them, Valerius said, his voice low and grim. We are a message written in our blood and steel. The Imperium may not hear our astropathic cry, but they will find our wreckage. They will see what was done to us, and they will know, Allah had full. It is not victory we seek now. It is a witness. The Eternal Crusader turned, a majestic, doomed Leviathan, its engines flaring as it drove itself into the path of the silent, gliding knives of the Necron Armada. The rest of the battle fleet, seeing their flagships move, followed suit. It was a gesture of sublime, suicidal courage, a line of fire and faith, drawn against the inevitable tide of silent metal. The Necrons did not alter their course by a single degree. The crown-shaped vessel at the heart of the fleet, the ship of the Silent King himself, began to glow with a soft, internal luminescence. Tendrils of green light, like captured lightning, crawled across its impossible geometry. It was not aiming at the Imperial ships. It was aiming at the star at the center of the system, a stable, yellow sun that had nurtured life for billions of years. A beam of pure, concentrated entropy lanced out from the ground ship. It was not a weapon of heat or kinetic force. It was a command, a law of physics, rewritten. The beam struck the star. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the star began to dim. Its furious nuclear heart was being stilled. Its light and heat leached away into the hungry void. The vibrant yellow faded to a sickly orange, then a dull, cooling red. On the bridge of the Eternal Crusader, the external light faded as if a great dimmer switch was being turned down across the entire system. The star was not going supernova. It was being murdered, quietly, efficiently, and forever. The dying of the light was the most horrifying thing Proctor had ever witnessed. It was not a violent explosion, but a quiet, systemic murder. The star, the very heart of their system, was being extinguished. The vibrant yellow faded to a sickly orange, casting long, diseased shadows across the bridge. then it deepened to a bloody crimson, and finally to a dull, cooling ember. The temperature on the bridge began to drop almost immediately, a creeping cold that had nothing to do with the ship's life support. It was the cold of the grave, of a future that should never be. "Throne of Earth," Proctor whispered, his breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. He looked at the tactical display. Gamma minus 7 Tertius, the mining world, was still there, for now, but its sun was dead. In hours, its atmosphere would begin to freeze. In days, the oceans would turn to glaciers of oxygen ice. The 5 billion souls on the surface were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. Their fate was not conquest or conversion. It was simply deletion, a footnote erased from the galactic ledger. The Necron fleet continued its advance, gliding past the Imperial battle fleet as if it were so much stellar debris. The Imperial ships, their crews paralyzed by the cosmic-scale atrocity they had just witnessed, were utterly ignored. A few battery commanders, driven mad by the horror, fired their lances and macro cannons. The results were the same as before. Their fire was absorbed or dissipated, answered only by a single, precise disassembler beam that would surgically remove the offending vessel from existence.
The Eternal Crusader was spared. It was not an act of mercy. It was an act of supreme contempt. They were not worth the energy it would take to destroy them. Valerius stood ramrod straight, his knuckles white as he gripped the command rail. He watched the main hololith, which now showed the Necron fleet approaching the frozen, darkening sphere of Gamma 7. They did not deploy troops. They did not launch bombardment. The crown ship of the Silent King activated another system. From its center, a different kind of energy pulsed a wave of shimmering silver light that washed over the planet. Where it touched, the world changed. The rugged mountain ranges, deep canyons, and sprawling hive cities did not explode. They flattened. It was as if a god had taken a massive trowel and smoothed the planet's surface into a featureless, perfectly level plane of gray metal. The process was silent, methodical, and comprehensive. Every trace of biology, every work of human hands, every memory and dream etched into that world was scoured away, replaced by a blank, sterile canvas. In less than an hour, a living world had been converted into a silent, lifeless landing pad. "This is not war," Valerius said, his voice hollow, the sound of a man whose faith has been shattered on the anvil of a cruel reality. "This is gardening. They are pruning a weed. We are the weed." He turned to Proctor, his eyes holding a final grim command. "The astropath is gone. Our fleet is broken. Our star is dead. But the Crusaders' core logister is hardened." It recorded everything. The visual data, the sensor readings, the history lesson. He gestured to a data slate on his console. "I am encoding a final log entry. You will take an Arvis lighter. Take the slate. Use the gravitational anomaly of the dead star to slingshot you out of the system. Do not use the warp drive. Their silence field may only extend so far. Go, now." Proctor stared, a protest dying on his lips. He saw the absolute, unyielding finality in his admiral's eyes. This was not a request. It was the last will and testament of an Imperial commander. His duty was no longer to fight, but to flee, to bear witness. "And you, my lord?" Proctor asked, his voice thick. Valerius turned back to the viewport, to the geometrically perfect Necron fleet now settling upon the smooth surface of the dead world. "I will wait," he said softly. "I will wait for the cold to take this ship. I will wait, and I will watch. Someone must record the end. Now go." The silence that descended upon the Eternal Crusader was heavier than any battle damage, colder than the void now leaching through the hull. The frantic shouts, the blaring klaxons, the hum of active systems, all of it was gone, replaced by the creak of contracting metal and the faint, desperate hiss of atmosphere bleeding into a dead sky. The only light on the bridge came from the emergency lumiglobes, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the frozen forms of the crew. Some were still at their posts, their hands locked to controls that were now useless. Others had simply collapsed, their faith and will broken by the silent, systematic annihilation they had witnessed. Lord Admiral Valerius remained standing at the viewport, a statue of imperial resolve in a tomb of his own making. He watched the Necron fleet. They did not celebrate their victory. They did not communicate. They simply settled. The crowned ship of the Silent King descended to the center of the smoothed metallic plain that had once been Gamma 7 Tertius, and the other vessels arranged themselves around it in a perfect, silent geometric pattern. It was not an occupation. It was a reclamation. A master returning to a property he had long ago abandoned. Brushing aside the dust and the pests that had accumulated in his absence, his gaze shifted to the dead star. It was now a black cinder, a hole punched in the fabric of the sky. Its light and life stolen to fuel what? Some unknowable, ancient purpose. This was the true horror, the core of the Imperium's fear. The Tyranids sought to consume all biomass. Chaos sought to twist all reality. The Orcs sought a good fight. But the Necrons, they sought to restore a universe to a state of perfect, silent order. A universe without the messy, chaotic, and fragile spark of life. A universe of dust and metal, forever. He thought of Proctor. The young man would be in the launch bay by now, the encoded data slate sealed against his chest like a holy relic. He would be praying to the Emperor for a miracle, for a sliver of a chance. Valerius knew there were no miracles left in this corner of the galaxy. There was only the grim, statistical probability that the lighter might escape the nullfield's edge before its life support failed or the cold seized its engines. It was a hope so faint it was barely a whisper. But in the grim darkness of the far future, even a whisper was a thing worth dying for. A new light flickered on the dead world below. From the crown ship, a pillar of pure, white energy stabbed upwards, not into the sky, but into the fabric of space itself. It was a beacon, but not one meant for human eyes. It was a signal, a call across the gulf of dead space, a summons. And Valerius, with a chilling certainty, knew who it was calling. The other Necron dynasties, sleeping in their tomb worlds across the galaxy. The Silent King was not just reclaiming a single world. He was sounding the reveille for his entire, slumbering race. This was not an invasion. It was a waking. The cold was becoming a physical presence on the bridge, frosting the viewports, stealing the breath from his lungs. He could feel the immense, ancient gaze of the Silent King upon his ship, upon him. It was not a look of hatred, or even of interest. It was the same regard a man might give a stone he was about to step over. Valerius reached out a trembling, frost-rimed hand and activated the ship's internal Vox system one last time. The power was fading, the signal weak, but it would carry to every corner of the dying vessel. "This is Lord Admiral Valerius," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "To any soul who can hear this, remember us. Remember this day. The war you have fought until now, it was but a skirmish in the dawn of time. The true war, the war for reality itself, has just begun, and the enemy is silence." He let his hand fall. The last of the light died in the viewport as the ship's power core finally failed. The final thing he saw was not the darkness, but the unwavering, cold light of the Necron beacon. A promise of extinction written in a language older than mankind itself. The Arvis lighter, designation witness, shuddered as it broke from the magnetic containment of the Eternal Crusader's launch bay. The void that greeted Proctor was not the star-dusted black he knew. It was a suffocating cloak of absolute night. The dead star was a blot, a sphere of nothingness that seemed to pull at his soul. He did not look back at the battleship. He could not bear to see her final, frozen form, a ghost ship already beginning its eternal drift. His hands, slick with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature, flew across the control panel. The slingshot trajectory was pre-plotted, a desperate gamble on a gravitational well that was no longer a source of life, but a corpse. The lighter's engines flared, pushing him into a wide, accelerating arc around the dead star. The G-forces pressed him into his seat. Inside his mind, a single mantra played on a loop. "The slate must get through! The slate must get through!" It was a prayer, a shield against the terrifying silence that pressed in from all sides. He checked the sensor suite. a pathetic collection of instruments meant for planetary landings, not for sensing the movements of gods. It showed nothing. The Necron fleet was simply absent from the scans, as if they were phantoms. The only thing his sensors registered was the yawning gravitational signature of the dead sun and the fading, cold thermal blooms of the dying Imperial fleet. Then, the lighter's tiny warp drive indicator flickered from red to a tentative amber. He was at the extreme edge of the projected null field. It was now or never. He input the command, a single jump, short, desperate, and blind. The coordinates were set for a supposedly secure Imperial relay outpost 3 light-years away. He prayed it was still there. He prayed the Astronomicon could still be felt. He prayed to an emperor who suddenly felt very, very far away. He engaged the drive. The universe did not tear. It stuttered. There was no tumultuous roar of the immaterium, no kaleidoscope of damned souls and shifting geometry. Instead, the stars outside the viewport stretched into sickly, gray streaks. The lighter groaned, its frame stressed not by the fury of the warp, but by the violent, unnatural stillness of its passage. It was like trying to swim through solid rock. Proctor was thrown against his restraints, his vision spotting. This was wrong. This was not how warp travel worked. The Necron's silence was not a bubble. It was a stain, a viscosity that clung to real space itself, making even escape a brutal physical trial. After an eternity of pressure and silence, the lighter burst back into real space. The transition was not a relief, but a jarring impact. Alarms blared. Hull integrity was compromised. Life support was failing. But the warp drive indicator was green. He was outside the field. He had done it. With shaking hands, he activated the long-range Voxcaster, powering it directly from the dying lighter's emergency cells. He input the relay outpost's designation and began to transmit, his voice a raw, broken thing. Calling Imperial Relay Sigma. Anyone? This is the lighter witness. From the battleship Eternal Crusader. Lord Admiral Valerius's final command.
It transmitted the data slate's contents in a compressed, frantic burst. The visuals of the Necron fleet, the death of the star, the scouring of the world, the image of the Silent King, the Admiral's last, grim log entry. He poured every byte of recorded horror into the void, aiming it at the distant, hopefully listening outpost. He received no acknowledgement. The lighter was dying around him. The air was getting thin. He slumped over the console, his strength gone, his duty fulfilled. He had no way of knowing if his message had been heard. He had no way of knowing if the relay outpost had been swallowed by some other, distant war. He was a single, dying man in a crippled ship, floating in an uncaring galaxy. But in a sterile, silent chamber on a distant Imperial outpost, a data servitor chirped, processing and incoming. Priority 1 transition. It began to download the file, its logic engines struggling to parse the catastrophic data. The first images to resolve on the monitor were of the crown-shaped vessel and the dead, dark star, and deep within the outpost's newspheric network, a single, automated alert was triggered. It was not a message of victory or discovery. It was a quarantine warning, a scream of absolute, terminal dread, encoded in cold, hard data. The warning was simple, and it began to propagate through the Imperium's secret channels, a whisper of impending doom. SCAREKH has returned northeast. The galaxy is his to reclaim. All is dust. The quarantine warning propagated through the Imperium's secret channels like a virus, a ghost in the machine of the Adeptus Administratum. It bypassed the standard, sluggish routes of astropathic choirs and courier ships, traveling instead through the clandestine newspheric networks of the Inquisition and the highest echelons of the Adeptus Mechanicus. It was a data ghost, a scream of pure information that was too catastrophic for most systems to even process. It first manifested as a series of corrupted data logs in a listening post on the edge of the Segmentum Solar. A tech priest, his mechadendrites twitching with agitation, saw the fragmented images, a star dying not in fire, but in silence, a world smoothed into a geometric plane, a fleet of impossible, silent ships, The name attached to the Phyllis chart meant nothing to him, but the cryptographic authentication was of the highest order, a cipher used only for existential threats. He forwarded it immediately, his flesh hand trembling as he performed the rite of data purification, fearing the file itself was a Xenos mimetic hazard. The message climbed the ossified hierarchy of the Imperium. It reached the desk of an inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos, a stern woman named Katerina. In her fortress on the world of Scintilla, she had spent a lifetime studying Xenos threats. She had faced the insidious Janus dealer cults, the rapacious Drakari, the boundless Tyrannid swarms. But this was different. This was not a biological or a chaotic threat. It was a historical one, a cosmological one. Reviewing the data slate's contents, she felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The Silent King was not a myth. It was a verdict, and he had just passed judgment on the entire human race. She called a clandestine conclave in a shielded chamber, hidden from even the eyes of the Adeptus Astartes. She presented the evidence to a select few, a grizzled Death Watch captain, a high-ranking magos of the Mechanicus, and a representative of the Officio Assassinorum. The Ghoul Star's garrison is gone, she stated, her voice devoid of emotion. Gamma Minus 7 Tertius has been unmade, not conquered. Unmade. The tactical data suggests our current military doctrine is not merely inadequate, it is irrelevant. Their technology operates on principles we cannot counter. Their very presence negates the warp. The Death Watch captain, his face a mask of grim resolve, studied the hololith of the Necron disassembler beams. There is always a weakness, a chink in the armor. We must gather intelligence, a surgical strike. To what end? The Magos interrupted, his bionic vocalizer buzzing with uncharacteristic distress. You speak of armor. They do not have armor. They have reality itself as their shield. The report indicates they possess technology capable of stellar manipulation. This is not a war we can win through force of arms. This is a war against physics. The Assassinorum representative, a pale and silent figure, finally spoke. And the solution is not a battle fleet. It is a single, precise cut. This Silent King, if he leads them, he can be made to fall. A single bullet, a single blade, in the right place. Inquisitor Katerina shook her head. And how do you propose to get that blade close to him? They're null-field Begate Psychers. Their technology outclasses ours by 60 million years. They do not communicate. They do not negotiate. They do not boast. They simply act. They are the embodiment of inevitability.
She stood, pacing before the grim display. The Imperium's fear of the Necrons has, until now, been an academic one. A fear of dusty tombs and forgotten legends. That time is over. The fear must now become a tangible, guiding principle. We must reevaluate everything. We must cease our infighting, our border wars, our purges of heresy that suddenly seem so trivial. We must look to our oldest records, our most forbidden vaults. We must find a weapon, not of man, but from the age before man, because if we do not, she let the sentence hang in the air, the unspoken conclusion more terrifying than any daemon. The war for the galaxy's future had begun, and humanity was not just outgunned, it was obsolete. The only thing left was to find a way to delay the final, silent sunset. The conclave dissolved into a silence more profound than any debate. The scale of the threat had rendered their respective arsenals, the Space Marine chapters, the Assassin temples, the Mechanicus war machines, seem like the toys of children. Inquisitor Katerina dismissed them, each to their own desperate, long-shot endeavors. The Death Watch would attempt to capture a Necron artifact, a near-suicidal mission. The Assassinorum would begin theoretical planning for a target that was likely untouchable. The Mechanicus would delve into heresy, searching for any shred of Dark Age technology that might counter the living metal. But Katerina had a different path in mind, a more dangerous one. She retreated to her personal sanctum, a chamber lined with data coffins and forbidden texts. She bypassed the records of the Ordo Xenos, the carefully curated knowledge of the Necrons as a xenospecies. Instead, she accessed a deeper, far more classified archive, sealed by the Ordo Malleus itself. She was not looking for military data. She was looking for prophecy. For hours, she sifted through fragmented accounts, the mad ravings of sanctioned psychers who had glimpsed possible futures. Most were useless, pertaining to the machinations of chaos. But a pattern, faint and terrible, began to emerge from the chaos. Visions of a silent galaxy, prophecies of a great stillness that would consume the warp itself. One particularly chilling account, from a psyker who had been driven catatonic after a vision, spoke of a king of dust whose return would force the ancient enemies mankind and the archenemy to a precipice. When the star god's heir returns to his throne, the transcript read, "The thirsting gods will shriek in fury for a meal denied. The anathema's children and the neverborn shall gaze upon the same abyss and see their own extinction reflected back." Katarina leaned back, her blood running cold. The implications were staggering. The Necrons, with their null fields, were not just a threat to the Imperium, they were a threat to chaos itself. The ruinous powers fed on the raw emotion of sentient life. A galaxy silenced, rendered into sterile, unfeeling metal, was a galaxy in which they would starve. The Necrons were the only force in existence that posed an existential threat to both the Imperium and the powers of the warp. This changed everything. It meant that the Imperium's greatest, most hated enemy could, in theory, become a temporary, horrifying ally, or at the very least, a weapon to be pointed at the other. The thought was heresy so profound it threatened to unravel her soul. To even consider leveraging the power of the Silent King against the dark gods was to dance on the edge of damnation. Yet, the alternative was the absolute certainty of a silent, soulless galaxy. Meanwhile, in the depths of the warp, the echo of the Silent King's return was also felt. In a fortress of screaming brass and molten skin, a being of infinite rage and malice paused in its eternal conquest. It felt a sudden, sharp constriction in the immaterium, a void where the screams of a dying star should have been. It was a sensation not of pain, but of absence. And to a creature of pure, chaotic emotion, absence was a deeper agony than any wound. It turned its baleful gaze towards the source of the silence, and a new, singular hatred began to burn in its primordial heart. The great game would continue, but a new, utterly alien piece had been placed on the board. Back in her sanctum, Katarina made a decision. She would not just prepare for war, she would seek a cataclysm. She began to compose a message, encrypted with ciphers that had not been used since the Horus Heresy. It was not a call to arms. It was a warning and a question, directed at the most secretive and radical of her Ordo. The message contained only a single, devastating line, appended to the data from the witness. "The Silent King has returned. He does not seek to corrupt our souls. He seeks to unmake them. Do we stand with the daemon to destroy the machine, or do we use the machine to destroy the daemon? Or do we simply pray for a swift end?" She sent the message into the void, knowing she had just crossed a line from which there was no return. The Imperium feared the Silent King's return because it presented a foe against which neither faith nor fury could prevail. It presented a future with no salvation, only a choice of extinctions. The encrypted message from Inquisitor Katarina did not travel far. It was intercepted and rerouted, not by a Xenos intelligence or a demonic entity, but by the most ancient and paranoid human organization in existence. Deep within the hollowed-out asteroid that served as his mobile sanctum, a man known only as the distaff of the Ordo Sinister received the transmission. His title was not one of command, but of function. He was the keeper of the most terrible balance. His chambers were not lined with books, but with stasis cradles containing the minds of psychers who had glimpsed too much, their bodies gone, their consciousness preserved to calculate the paths of future catastrophe. He reviewed the data from the witness. He studied Katarina's radical, heretical question, and he did something no other living soul had the authority to do. He activated a comms unit of Dark Age origin, a device that bypassed the warp entirely, and sent a single pulsed data burst to a recipient hidden within the Sol system. The message reached a vault buried so deep beneath the Imperial Palace that the rock above it was fused to glass from the heat of the Emperor's ascent during the Horus Heresy. Here, sealed from time and space, sat three figures. They were the triad of the final contingency, the last resort of a dead man's will. One was a chronogladiator of the Legio Custodes, his armor scarred by wounds that had not yet been inflicted. The second was a magos of the Mechanicus, his form so integrated with the vault's machinery that he was more a component than a man. The third was a hollowed-out Psychana automata, a vessel containing the distilled, silent scream of 1,000 sacrificed astropaths. The custodian received the data. He did not speak. He did not need to. The three entities interfaced, their combined consciousness accessing a sliver of the Emperor's final, unspoken design. The order they issued was not recorded in any log. It was not debated in any council. It was a silent adjustment to the Imperium's deepest, most terrible protocols. On the Forge world of Griffon IV, a tech priest Dominus received a binary command directly into his noospheric implants. The source was untraceable, the authority absolute. Without question, he halted all production on a new line of Shadowsword tanks and diverted all resources to a long-dormant project, the restoration of the Pylon network schematics, ancient anti-warp devices whose origins were decidedly not human. In the Segmentum Tempestus, a Black Templar's crusade fleet, en route to purge a world tainted by chaos, received a sudden and inexplicable course correction from a passing Navigators Guild tender. The new coordinates pointed them towards a dead system on the edge of the galactic core, a place of ancient, silent ruins. The message accompanying the correction was a single baffling phrase: "The enemy of my enemy is still my enemy, but he may clear the path." And in the ghastly light of the Eye of Terror, Abaddon the Despoiler, War Master of Chaos, felt the shift. The constant, screaming chorus of the gods, for the first time in 10,000 years, faltered. For a single, terrifying moment, it was replaced by a focused, unified shriek of pure, undiluted hatred, not for the Corpse Emperor, but for something else, something that threatened the very food upon which they feasted. The long war had not ended, but a new, more primal conflict had just been declared. The Imperium's fear was no longer a passive, dreading thing. It had become an active, calculating force. It was preparing not for a war it could win, but for an apocalypse it might survive by hiding in the shadow of a greater one. The return of the Silent King had not just brought war. It had rewritten the rules of existence, forcing gods and men alike to make choices that defied all previous understanding. The galaxy held its breath, waiting for the next move in a game where every piece was a weapon of mass extinction. The silence that had fallen over the ghoul stars was not empty. It was a physical, predatory thing. It was the silence of a predator that had fed and was now digesting, its gaze turning slowly towards the rest of the herd. From the smoothed, metallic plane of the former Gamma-7 Tertius, the Necron fleet began to move. It did not advance in a battle line or an invasion formation. It simply dispersed. Scythe ships and harvesters vanished into flickering, inaudible teleportations, their destinations unknown. The crown ship of the Silent King remained, a monstrous, black throne at the center of the dead system, a new, fixed point of dread in the galactic cartography. Its first summons had been answered. Across the galaxy, on worlds long thought to be barren or merely haunted, the Earth trembled. On the dust-choked death world of Zantragora, a place avoided by Imperial scouts for millennia due to its ghost winds, the sand seas parted. A monolithic structure of green-black metal, a tomb citadel, breached the surface with the slow, inexorable grace of a leviathan rising from the deep. Its portals irised open, and legions of Necron warriors marched forth in perfect, silent lockstep, their oculars burning with the same cold fire as their returning master. On the agri-world of Viridia, where the soil was so rich it was said to bleed, the harvest suddenly failed, not from blight or drought, but from a deep, subterranean cold that leached all vitality from the land. The planet's core, it was discovered by panicked Mechanicus surveyors, was being systematically drained, its geothermal energy harvested by awakening machinery that had slumbered beneath the continents for eons. The world was not being invaded. It was being consumed from the inside out. Its life used to fuel the resurrection of a long-dormant dynasty. These were not isolated events. They were a pattern, a symphony of awakening conducted by the Silent King. Each tomb world that stirred, did so with a new, unified purpose. The petty squabbles and dynastic rivalries that had once fractured the Necron race seemed subdued, overridden by a singular galactic directive from their returned sovereign. They were not just claiming territory, they were re-establishing a network, a celestial infrastructure of terrifying scope. Aboard the last, dying Arvis lighter, Proctor's final, fragmented Voxcast was not the only warning. A Deathwatch kill team, operating on the fringes of the Awakened Zone, managed to plant a seismic charge on a rising monolith. The explosion did no damage to the living metal, but it revealed the truth. The monolith was not a building, it was a node, a conduit. It was connecting to something, aligning with other, identical structures across the sector, forming a grid of incalculable power. The kill team's last transmitted image, before they were erased by a silent, green flash, was of the monolith's apex projecting a thin, unwavering beam of black light into the sky, a beam that did not illuminate, but rather subtracted light from the void. In her sanctum, Inquisitor Katarina received these scattered, horrifying reports. She pieced them together, the pattern becoming terrifyingly clear. The Necrons were not merely conquering worlds, they were recalibrating the galaxy itself. They were building a cage. The pylon network the Mechanicus was now desperately trying to replicate was not just a defensive measure, it was the original design. The Necrons were the architects of reality's leash on the warp, and they were now systematically repairing and reactivating their masterwork. The true reason the Imperium feared the Silent King's return was now laid bare. It was not his invincible fleet, nor his unbreakable soldiers, nor his reality-altering technology. It was his vision. A vision of a perfectly ordered, perfectly silent, perfectly dead universe. A universe where the flame of human spirit, with all its passion, its faith, its chaos, and its hope, was not just extinguished, but had never been allowed to exist at all. The war against chaos was a war for the soul of humanity. The war against the Necrons was a war against the very concept of a soul. The galaxy was not merely at war, it was being systematically reprogrammed. The Necron awakening was a cascade failure of reality as humanity knew it. On the Forge world of Griffon IV, the tech priests worked in a frenzy of terrified devotion. Their attempts to reconstruct the pylon technology based on ancient, fragmented schematics. They had managed to erect a single, crude prototype, a spire of screaming metal and sputtering energy that sought to mimic the silent, perfect monoliths now rising across the sector. When they activated it, the result was not a controlled null field. It was a catastrophic implosion of the immaterium. Daemons, screaming in agony as their very essence was unraveled by the flawed device, were pulled into real space only to be annihilated. But the backlash tore the Forge world's capital hive asunder, creating a permanent, localized warp storm. The lesson was clear. Mankind was a child playing with the tools of a god, and the first attempt had resulted in self-mutilation. In the dead system that had been the Eternal Crusader's tomb, the Silent King's crown ship initiated the next phase. The beacon of white energy, which had been a summons, now changed frequency. It began to pulse, a slow, rhythmic thrum that resonated not through space, but through the underlying dimensions of the universe. On every world where a Necron monolith had been activated, the black beams of subtractive light intensified. They began to weave together, forming a lattice of terrifying scale, a web of silence stretching across the stars. Where the strands of this web intersected, the laws of physics hardened. Warp travel became impossible, not just dangerous. Astropathic communication ceased entirely. Psychers, from the lowest grade sanctioned Imperial telepath to the most powerful chaos sorcerer, were struck blind and mute. Their connection to the Imperium was severed as if by a guillotine. On a Thousand Suns warship, a sorcerer lord mid-incantation simply crumbled to dust, his body unable to exist without the constant influx of the warp's energy. In the Imperial Palace, the Golden Throne, sustained by the sacrifice of countless psychers, flickered. For one heart-stopping second, the Astronomican's light wavered. Across the entire Imperium, navigators screamed as their third eye was scoured by a blinding, silent whiteness. The galaxy was being cut off, sector by sector, isolated into silent, doomed archipelagos. This was the Silent King's grand strategy. He was not fighting a war of attrition. He was performing a galactic-scale lobotomy. He was severing the nerve that connected sentience to the cosmos, rendering the chaotic, emotional races of the galaxy powerless. The Orc's wah field would dissipate. The Tyranid's synaptic web would fray without the background noise of the warp to guide it. The Aeldari, beings of pure psychic resonance, would simply fade into nothingness. And humanity, its empire built on a foundation of psychic travel and communication, would shatter into a million isolated, helpless fragments, easy to sweep away. Inquisitor Katerinya received the last broken transmission from Griffon IV before the silence fell over her sector. She saw the fate of the Forge world. She understood the horrific perfection of the Necron plan. Her radical idea of using the Necrons as a weapon against chaos was a pathetic fantasy. You could not wield the hand that was strangling you. She looked at the data slate on her desk, the one containing Admiral Valerius's final log. She played his last words, his voice rasping in the frozen air of her sanctum. The true war, the war for reality itself, has just begun, and the enemy is silence. He had been more right than he could ever have known. The Imperium had feared the wrong things for 10,000 years. They had feared the Xenos, the mutant, the heretic. They had built an empire on faith in a dying god. But the true enemy was not a thing that could be fought with bolters and faith. The true enemy was the end of the song, the final, perfect, and eternal quiet. The Silent King had returned, and he was not bringing war. He was bringing the end of noise. He was turning out the lights. The silence was absolute. Inquisitor Katerinya's sanctum was a tomb. The constant subliminal hum of the noosphere was gone. The whisper of incoming data streams had ceased. The only sound was the frantic, too loud beating of her own heart. She was cut off. Scintilla, one of the most populous and connected worlds in the Segmentum Obscurus, was now a silent island in a dead sea. She knew, with a certainty that felt like a physical weight, that the same scene was playing out on every Imperial world touched by the Necron's waking web. Hive cities, dependent on astropathic relays for coordination, would be descending into panicked anarchy. Battle fleets were now blind and deaf, their navigators useless, their admirals unable to communicate with Terra or even with ships in the next system. The Imperium of Man, a galaxy-spanning empire for 10,000 years, had just been shattered into billions of isolated shards. This was not a temporary blackout. This was a fundamental rewriting of the rules of existence. The Necrons were not blockading. They were re-engineering the very medium through which the Imperium lived and breathed. The warp, for all its horrors, was the substrate of human civilization. Now, it was being methodically drained away, replaced by a sterile, unyielding reality where only the cold, hard logic of the physical universe held sway. A reality where faith had no power, because there was nothing beyond the material to have faith in. Her gaze fell upon a small, ornate reliquary on her desk. Within was a fragment of a saint's bone, said to weep in the presence of daemons. It was inert, not just dormant, but dead. The psychic resonance, the divine energy she had felt emanating from it for decades, was gone. It was just a piece of calcium and carbon. A profound, soul-crushing despair threatened to overwhelm her. If a saint's relic could be rendered mundane, what hope was there for the Emperor's light? What was the Imperium without its faith? Yet from that despair, a grim, cold resolve began to form. A resolve born not of hope, but of spite. She activated a hardline, land-based voxcaster, its range limited to the planet's surface. Her voice, when she spoke, was stripped of all emotion, a sharp clinical instrument. This is Inquisitor Katerinya of the Ordo Xenos. By the authority of the Emperor, I am enacting Contingency Primus. All planetary governance is hereby suspended and placed under martial law administered by my office. All astropathic choirs are to be sedated and secured. All navigators are to be isolated for study. The use of any and all warp-based or psychic technology is henceforth forbidden under penalty of death. She took a breath, the next order the most heretical of all. Furthermore, all research and development efforts are to be immediately redirected. All theological debate is suspended. The sole focus of our surviving scientific and industrial capacity will be the physical, ballistic weapons, conventional propulsion, non-psychic communication. We will learn to fight, to travel, and to speak again, as our most ancient ancestors did in the cold, hard silence. We will become as they are. We will become material. It is the only way to endure. She was not saving the soul of humanity. She was sacrificing it to save the body. She was preparing her people for a universe without gods, without miracles, without the warp, a universe ruled by the Silent King. She was forging a humanity that could survive in the grim, dark, and now utterly silent future. A humanity of stone and iron, its heart as cold and dead as the stars the Necrons were extinguishing. The war was over. The long, slow, silent extinction had begun. The silence was not merely an absence of sound on Scintilla. It was a new ecological reality. The planet's weather patterns, subtly influenced by the planet's collective psychic imprint for millennia, began to falter. The great atmospheric currents, which had carried moisture from the equatorial oceans to the northern hive continents, stalled. Unseasonal frosts glazed the upper spires of hives that had never known a temperature below boiling. The people felt it too, a profound, existential disquiet that had nothing to do with the news of martial law. It was the feeling of being utterly, cosmically alone. The comforting lie that the Emperor watched from Terra had been exposed. There was only the void, and the silent, patient things moving within it. Inquisitor Katarina's new regime was brutal and efficient. She ruled from a command bunker deep beneath the capital hive, its walls lined with lead and plasteel to block out the last fading echoes of the Imperium. Her agents, the few she could still trust, moved through the panicked cities like surgeons, amputating the infected parts of their society. A rogue psyker, driven mad by the sudden severance of their powers, was not exorcised. They were put down with a bullet to the head. A ecclesiarchy preacher who called for a mass prayer to reignite the Astronomicon was arrested for sedition and wasting resources. Faith was now a liability. Superstition was a death sentence. Her tech adepts, stripped of their comforting rituals to the machine god, were set to a terrifying new task: reverse engineering the principles of the Necron null field from the catastrophic failure at Griffin IV. They worked in sterile labs, their efforts focused on creating a localized, stable zone of reality, a stillness bubble that could protect a ship or a facility from the Necron's primary weapon. Their first successful test was a small, humming cube that, when activated, rendered the area within its field utterly dead to the warp. A sanctioned psyker brought into the field vomited and collapsed, his mind screaming in a vacuum. It was a horrifying creation, a tool of the enemy turned back on itself. Katarina saw it not as a victory, but as a grim necessity. To fight the dark, they had to become a deeper shade of black. Meanwhile, the Necron advance continued its methodical, unconcerned pace. They did not invade Scintilla. They did not need to. A single crescent-shaped Necron vessel entered the system. It did not approach the planet. It took up a position at the system's edge, near the lifeless gas giant of Scintilla Secundus. Then, it began to harvest. Beams of green energy lanced out, not as weapons, but as mining tools, stripping the gas giant of its hydrogen and helium at an impossible rate. The process was silent, efficient, and utterly indifferent to the billions of humans watching from the inner world. It was a demonstration of supreme galactic scale priority. They were not here for conquest. They were here for raw materials. Humanity was not an enemy to be defeated. It was clutter to be cleared once the useful elements were collected. From her bunker, Katarina watched the sensor feeds of the harvesting ship. There were no grand speeches, no declarations of war from the Silent King. There was only the silent, inexorable consumption. This was the final, crushing truth of the Necron threat. They were not motivated by hatred or rage or even a desire for power.
They were motivated by a purpose so vast, so alien, that humanity's entire existence was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience in its fulfillment. She looked at the tactical map of the sector. One by one, the stars were winking out, not from destruction, but from being silenced. The great tapestry of the Imperium was being unpicked. Thread by thread, there would be no epic last stand, no final, glorious battle for Terra. There would only be the slow, quiet dimming of the light, the gradual cooling of worlds, and the final, eternal silence of a galaxy returned to its rightful, soulless owners. Her work, her brutal, faithless pragmatism, would perhaps allow a remnant of humanity to cling to existence in the dark, like lichen on a rock. But the age of mankind was over. The age of the machine had begun, and its king was silent. The harvested gases from Scintilla Secundus did not fuel engines or power reactors in any way humanity could comprehend. Aboard the crescent-shaped Necron harvester, the raw elemental matter was subjected to forces that rewrote its fundamental properties, transmuting it into a shimmering, liquid-state energy that pulsed with a cold, green light. This energy was not consumed, but woven. It was fed into colossal projectors that extended from the ship's hull like the needles of a blind, cosmic seamstress. These projectors began to stitch beams of coherent reality. Threads of hardened physics were shot into the void. They did not travel in straight lines. They curved, following invisible, preordained pathways, connecting to the other threads being spun by harvesters in adjacent, silenced systems. Slowly, agonizingly, a structure began to take shape in the interstellar darkness between stars. It was not a physical wall, but a filigree of absolute law, a web of enforced causality. It was the next evolution of the pylon network, not merely a null field to suppress the warp, but a celestial lattice to redefine reality within its bounds. Within the area enclosed by this growing lattice, the universe became simple, predictable. The comforting, chaotic uncertainty of quantum mechanics was smoothed away. Entropy itself was slowed. It was a universe where miracles were impossible, because the very concept of a statistical anomaly had been legislated out of existence. It was the ultimate expression of order, a gilded cage for physics itself. On Scintilla, the effects were subtle but profound. A team of Catarinia's scientists, experimenting with a new plasma reactor design, found that it performed with 100% efficiency, exactly as their most optimistic models had predicted. There were no random fluctuations, no unexpected energy spikes. It was perfect, and therefore sterile. A poet in a lower hive, attempting to compose a verse about the fading memory of the sun, found he could only write literal, factual statements. Metaphor, the soul of language, had died. The lattice was not just silencing the warp, it was silencing the human spirit, the very thing that sought meaning beyond the material. Catarinia received the reports, the perfect reactor, the literal-minded poet. She understood now that the Silent King's goal was not genocide. It was a fundamental correction of a flawed cosmos. The Necrons saw the warp, and the psychic life that fed it, as a cosmic error, a dangerous and volatile imperfection. In an otherwise orderly universe, they were not destroying the Imperium. They were debugging creation, and humanity was a corrupted line of code. Her Vox bead, now a purely hardwired device, crackled to life. It was the captain of her personal guard. "My lady, we have a situation at the Cathedral of the Emperor's Divine Light. A congregation has gathered. They are not praying. They are waiting." Catarinia ascended from her bunker, moving through the hive's silent, frost-rind streets. The cathedral was a magnificent structure of soaring arches and stained glass, now dull and lifeless without the sun. Inside, thousands of people stood, packed together. They were not chanting. They were not led by any priest. They simply stood, their faces upturned, their eyes closed. They were not seeking a god. They were listening for an absence so vast it had become a presence. One man, a simple laborer by his worn clothing, turned as she entered. His eyes were clear, devoid of the panic she saw everywhere else. "They are coming, Inquisitor," he said, his voice calm. "Not to kill us. They are coming to turn the page. We are just ink, fading ink." In that moment, Catarinia's cold resolve met its match. You could not fight the page-turner. You could not rage against the reader, who had finished the book and was closing the cover. her martial law, her stillness bubbles, her faithless sign seat was all just a desperate, futile attempt to scrawl one last, messy word on a page that was already being swept clean. The Imperium's greatest fear was realized.
They were not just losing. They were being made irrelevant. The laborers' words were not a prophecy of doom, but a statement of fact. The end, when it came for Scintilla, was not an invasion. It was a conclusion. The celestial lattice surrounding the system reached a critical mass of coherence. The final thread was woven, and the web was complete. For a single, suspended moment, the entire Scintilla system existed in a state of perfect, unyielding physical law. Then, the Silent King's crown ship, which had remained motionless at the heart of its dead domain, initiated the final command. There was no cataclysm. There was no destructive beam or planet-shattering weapon. The change was systemic and instantaneous. Across Scintilla, every complex molecule based on carbon began to simplify. It was not a violent process. It was a gentle, inexorable unraveling. Plasteel reverted to its base polymers, then to simpler hydrocarbons, and then to constituent atoms. Ceramite crumbled into dust. Flesh and bone, the intricate machinery of life, peacefully disassociated. The towering hives, monuments to human endeavor, slumped like sandcastles in a rising tide, their forms flowing into a uniform, gray slurry. The very atmosphere itself began to break down, its oxygen bonding with surface elements in a final, silent oxidation. There was no pain. There was no time for it. One moment, there was a civilization. The next, there was a smooth, gently rolling plain of gray, mineral-rich soil, settling under the light of a cold, dead star. Every building, every road, every book, every memory, every human being, all were peacefully, utterly, and permanently simplified into their base components. The planet had been reset to factory settings. Inquisitor Katarina did not die fighting. She died understanding. In her final second, surrounded by the silent, dissolving walls of her command bunker, she felt no fear, only a profound, chilling clarity. The Necrons were not the enemy. They were the universe's immune system, and humanity had been a fever dream. She saw the truth of the Silent King's sorrow, a grief 60 million years old, for a life he had willingly sacrificed for a purpose that had now reached its bleak, logical end. Then, her thoughts unwound into silence, her consciousness dispersing into a cloud of neutral particles. The Necron fleet did not linger to survey its work. The harvesters retracted their projectors. The scythe ships gathered. The crown ship of the Silent King pulsed once, a command that resonated through the lattice. Then, the entire armada flickered and vanished, not into the warp, but by stepping sideways out of a reality they had just finished correcting. They moved on to the next system, the next page in the galactic book that needed to be turned. The Scintilla system was now silent, not just in the absence of sound, but in the absence of complexity. It was a perfect, sterile monument to order, a tomb not for a world, but for a concept. The concept of hope, the concept of chaos, the concept of a soul. The witness's data slate, containing Admiral Valerius's warning, was now the sole, irrelevant testament to a species that had screamed into the darkness. The darkness had not screamed back. It had simply listened, and then continued its silent, eternal work.